Most people think reform fails because it never passes. That's the story we usually tell. The proposal didn't have enough support. The politics got in the way. The funding fell through. Someone blocked it. But that explanation doesn't hold up in most real cases. In many cities, agencies, and institutions, reform does pass. It gets approved. It gets funded. It gets announced. There's a vote. There's a rollout. There's a press conference. On paper, everything works. And then something else happens. Progress slows. Not dramatically, not all at once, quietly. This episode is about that phase, the part almost no one explains. What happens after approval when the system stops pushing forward and starts drifting sideways? Before approval, incentives are aligned. There is urgency, there is visibility, there is pressure to move. People are rewarded for pushing the idea forward, building consensus, securing funding, and getting the vote. Progress is visible, credit is available. Momentum matters. Approval is the finish line for that phase. But after approval, the environment changes. The urgency fades, the spotlight moves on, the political credit is already assigned. What replaces momentum is exposure. From that point on, progress is no longer rewarded the same way. Execution introduces risk. Before approval, failing quietly is possible. After approval, failing publicly is not. So the system recalibrates. After approval, the incentive structure flips. Before approval, the question is, how do we make this happen? After approval, the question becomes, how do we avoid being blamed if it doesn't? That shift changes everything. Execution creates winners and losers. Delay spreads responsibility. Missing a deadline can usually be explained. A visible failure cannot. So the safest behavior becomes incremental movement, enough activity to show progress, but not enough commitment to create exposure. This isn't sabotage, it's adaptation. People inside systems learn very quickly what gets rewarded and what gets punished. Speed used to be rewarded, now caution is. Results used to be celebrated, now risk avoidance is. That's when reform starts slowing down. Implementation doesn't happen in a straight line. Once something is approved, it enters a different machine. Tasks are broken up, responsibilities are assigned, timelines are outlined. But instead of one owner, there are many participants. Implementation spreads across departments, agencies, vendors, committees, and reporting structures. Each group has a role, each group has constraints, each group has its own incentives. What no one has is full ownership of the outcome. That's not accidental, it's structural. The more complex the reform, the more distributed the responsibility becomes, and distribution feels safe until something goes wrong. When responsibility is shared, accountability becomes unclear. If a deadline slips, it's rarely because someone failed outright. It's because something upstream wasn't ready, or a dependency changed, or coordination took longer than expected. Each explanation is reasonable. Taken together, they become permanent delay. No single person feels responsible for the whole. Everyone feels responsible for their part. And when outcomes are shared, consequences usually aren't. Accountability doesn't disappear, it dissolves. Not through neglect, but through design. Once accountability dissolves, timelines stretch naturally. Not because people stop working, but because delay becomes safer than resolution. A slow project can always be explained. A failed project cannot. So progress slows just enough to remain defensible. Reports are still filed, meetings still happen, updates are still delivered. Nothing looks broken, but nothing actually improves. This is how systems stall without ever officially failing. This is where reform truly breaks down. Success stops being measured by outcomes. It starts being measured by activity. Meetings held, documents completed, funds allocated, processes followed. All motion, no resolution. Activity is easy to document. Outcomes are harder to guarantee. So activity becomes the proxy for progress. And once activity becomes the metric, finishing the job becomes optional. This isn't about incompetence, and it isn't about bad intent. Most people inside these systems are capable, thoughtful, and sincere. The problem is structural. Systems reward safety over success, process over results, compliance over completion. People respond to incentives even when they don't realize it. When incentives change, behavior follows. Not because people are bad, but because systems shape behavior more than intentions do. When reform slows down, the costs don't disappear. They move. They show up as deferred maintenance, emergency spending, workarounds, and rising operating costs. These don't appear as failures, they appear as unexpected needs. That language matters. Unexpected needs don't trigger accountability, they trigger new funding requests. And the cycle continues. Once reform enters this state, it rarely fixes itself. Because the cost of delay is distributed and the cost of failure is concentrated. No single person feels the full impact of stagnation, but someone would feel the impact of visible failure. So the system stabilizes around slow movement. Enough activity to justify continuation, not enough progress to force resolution. That equilibrium can last for years. If you want to know whether a reform will actually finish, don't start with the announcement. Start with the structure underneath it. Because reforms don't stall because people suddenly become lazy. They stall because the system is allowed to drift without consequence. So the real question becomes simple. What would have to be true for a system to keep moving after the spotlight leaves? There are a few structural conditions that change everything. First, a reform needs a single owner for the outcome, not a committee, not a shared responsibility statement, a real owner. Shared ownership sounds collaborative, but it's usually just diluted accountability. One person or one office has to be able to say, "This is mine, the outcome is mine, the timeline is mine." If that doesn't exist, you don't have accountability. You have coordination, and coordination is where timelines go to die. Second, the system has to define success in outcome terms, not activity terms. Not meetings, not reports, not compliance, not implementation underway, outcomes. If the reform is about safety, the outcome is a measurable reduction. If it's about service, the outcome is response time and reliability. If it's about housing, the outcome is units delivered and occupancy stabilized, not just money allocated. Activity is easy to document, which is why systems love it. Outcomes are harder, which is why systems avoid them. But if you don't define outcomes, you create a situation where everyone can stay busy while nothing changes. Third, the reform needs deadlines that actually mean something. Most systems have dates, but dates are not deadlines if nothing happens when they slip. A real deadline changes behavior because it creates consequence, and consequence is what keeps execution from becoming optional. If missing a date triggers nothing but another meeting, then the system learns that dates are decorative. That's not cynicism. That's conditioning. Fourth, the incentives have to reach the implementation layer, not just the approval layer. Before approval, incentives are usually political or reputational. After approval, incentives become operational and personal. The people executing the reform need to be rewarded for finishing, not just for staying safe. And they need protection when real obstacles show up. Because if the system punishes risk and doesn't protect problem solving, then the safest move becomes delay. Fifth, the system needs visibility that doesn't depend on a press cycle. The problem with attention is that it moves on, so if transparency is informal, it fades. Finishing reforms requires ongoing visibility tied to outcomes, simple public dashboards, milestones, clear reporting that doesn't hide behind complexity. Not to embarrass people, but to keep the reform connected to reality. Because if the public can't see whether the thing is working, the system can always reframe stalling as progress. And finally, you need a feedback loop that forces correction. Most reforms stall because the system has no mechanism to confront the gap between intent and result. It has meetings, but not correction. A real feedback loop does two things. It surfaces failure early, and it forces a change in approach when something isn't working. That could mean changing a vendor, changing a timeline, changing the process, changing the implementation team, whatever it takes. Without that, the system stays in motion without improvement, because motion is safer than change. When those conditions exist, reform doesn't rely on energy, it relies on structure, and that's the point. The reason reform slows down after approval is not because people are inherently incapable. It's because the system is allowed to treat completion as optional. Change the structure, and you change the outcome. This is why reform so often slows down after approval. Not because the idea was wrong, not because people stopped caring, but because the system moved on. Credit was already assigned, risk was just beginning, and no one was rewarded for finishing the job. Until incentives change, this pattern repeats. Quietly. Predictably? Everywhere.